November 12, 1888. Redemption Gulch, Colorado. The temperature had fallen 20 degrees since noon, a fact that nature announced not with gentle persuasion but with a physical blow. The wind that scoured the high desert canyonlands was no longer a simple movement of air, it had become a blade, a solid thing that carried with it the fine, sharp dust of the rock and the killing frost of the upper peaks. It tore at the thin fabric of Annalise's coat, a garment made for a gentler season in a life that no longer existed. Down in the single dusty street of the settlement, doors were barred and windows shuttered, the faint glow of lanterns within looking as fragile as fireflies trapped in jars. Old man Orrin, a trapper whose face was a road map of winters past, caught her arm as she struggled to keep a sack of flour from being ripped from her grasp. His eyes, the color of a faded winter sky, held no warmth, only a grim, urgent clarity. "This ain't a normal cold, Annalise," he rasped, his voice a gravelly echo of the wind itself. "The geese flew south a month early. The bears went to their dens before the first frost. This is a killer coming. A winter that starves wolves and freezes the sap in the pines. You and your mother up in that rock trap, you got no wood. Not enough to last a week, let alone a winter like this 1 inch." He wasn't being cruel, he was stating a fact as plain and hard as the frozen earth beneath their feet. There was no timber in her canyon, nothing but scrub and sage. The last of the town's cordwood had been bought up by those with silver to spare. She had none. "We will manage, Orrin," she said, the words tasting like lies in her mouth. He shook his head, a slow, sad gesture. "No one manages a winter like this. They endure it or they die." He released her arm and pulled his furs tighter around his neck, a man retreating into a shell of survival she did not possess. He was right. The cold was a presence, an entity. It found every gap in her clothing, every crack in her resolve. It felt personal. This is the story of how Annalise, a widow of 24 with nothing but a barren canyon and a cryptic note to her name, proved them all wrong. The cold of that November afternoon was a cruel echo of the chill that had settled in her heart the previous spring. Her husband, Thomas, had wasted away in their small bed, his body consumed by a fever that no doctor could name and no prayer could quell. The sound she remembered most was not his pained whispers of love, but the dry, rattling cough that shook his frail frame, a sound like dead leaves skittering across a wooden floor. She remembered the helplessness of wiping his brow with a cool cloth while the heat of his life force evaporated into the air. When he died, the silence he left behind was louder and more terrifying than the cough had ever been. It was a vacuum that pulled everything else into it. Their farm, which had been his dream, became a monument to their failure. The drought of the past 2 years had baked the soil to brick, and the creek had dwindled to a muddy trickle. Without a harvest, there was no money to pay the bank. The man who came with the papers had not been unkind, but his sympathy was a procedural, empty thing. He had a job to do. Annalise and her mother, Maeve, whose hands were gnarled with arthritis and whose spirit seemed to shrink with every fresh sorrow, stood on the porch and watched as their life was inventoried. The rocking chair Thomas had made, the wedding quilt, the sturdy iron pots, all of it became part of a cold equation of debt. They were allowed to keep their personal effects, a few tools, and the old wagon with its sway-backed mule. They were adrift, 2 women with no anchor in a world that had little use for the grieving or the destitute. Maeve, at 72, looked as fragile as spun glass, her sorrow a quiet, constant presence. Annalise felt a fierce, desperate protectiveness for her, a feeling that was the only thing stronger than her own despair. Her grief for Thomas was a raw, open wound, but the fear for her mother's future was a sharpened spike driving her forward. They were not just losing a home, they were losing the world they understood. Just as the last of their hope seemed to gutter out, a letter arrived. It was from a lawyer in a town she'd never heard of, informing her that she was the sole heir to the property of her estranged father, a man she barely remembered. He had been a geologist, a man more in love with rocks and strata than with his own family, and had disappeared from her life when she was a child. The inheritance, the lawyer's letter explained with dry precision, was a single parcel of land, Section 22, a box canyon in the high desert of Colorado, deemed unsuitable for grazing, agriculture, or timber. It was worthless land, without water rights or any discernible resources. It was a final, posthumous shrug from a father she'd never known. Disappointment was a bitter, familiar taste. Yet, it was something. It was a place to go, a piece of the earth that no one could take from them. When the deed arrived, a small, folded piece of paper fell from within the envelope. It was not a letter, but a note scrawled in her father's spidery, academic hand on a piece of surveyor's parchment. It contained a single, baffling sentence. Stone remembers the sun. She read it a dozen times, trying to decipher its meaning. Was it a line of poetry? A final, cryptic jest? Maeve looked at it with tired eyes. He was always a strange man, filling his pockets with rocks and talking to the hills, she murmured. Annalise, however, folded the note carefully and tucked it into the small leather pouch where she kept Thomas's wedding band. It felt less like a message and more like a key, though she had no idea what lock it might fit. The word settled deep in her mind, a strange seed of an idea planted in the barren soil of her grief. It was all they had. A worthless canyon and a sentence that made no sense. It was on this flimsy foundation that she would have to build their entire world, or perish. The phrase became a quiet chant in her mind as they loaded the wagon, a mantra against the encroaching despair. Stone remembers the sun. Their arrival at Section 22 was a descent into silence and stone. The canyon was a narrow gash in the earth, its walls rising in sheer, layered cliffs of red and ochre sandstone. The floor was a bed of gravel and sand, dotted with hardy, skeletal sagebrush and the occasional stubborn juniper tree, twisted by the relentless wind into shapes of perpetual agony. There was no birdsong, only the sigh of the wind funneling between the rock walls. It was a place that felt ancient and indifferent to human life. Annalise walked the length of it, her boots crunching on the loose scree. It was stark, but there was a severe beauty to it, a sense of raw, elemental power. The south-facing wall glowed in the afternoon light, a vast canvas of warm color, while the north-facing wall already lay in a deep, cold shadow. They made a crude camp near the mouth of the canyon, the wagon their only shelter. The reality of their task was overwhelming. They had to survive here. A few days after their arrival, a man on horseback appeared, his shadow long and sharp in the morning sun. He introduced himself as Mr. Finch, a man whose face was pinched and whose eyes held the predatory gleam of a hawk. He informed them that he owned the rights to the only stream for 5 miles, a thin ribbon of water that ran a quarter-mile from their canyon's entrance. $1 a barrel, he stated, not asked. And I expect you won't be needing many. This place is a tomb. I offered your father a pittance for it years ago, just to square up my holdings. He was a fool. Now it belongs to a bigger one. It seems his gaze swept over Annalise, then to Maeve, who sat hunched on a crate, and finally to their meager supplies. A cruel smile touched his lips. You and your mother will be skeletons bleaching in the sun before the first snow. Mark my words. He tipped his hat with mocking politeness and rode away, leaving behind a cloud of dust and a fresh layer of dread. Annalise felt a surge of cold fury. His arrogance was a whetstone, sharpening her resolve. She would not become a skeleton for his amusement. She would not fail. In the weeks that followed, the canyon seemed determined to prove Mr. Finch right. Annalise worked from sunrise to sunset, her hands, once soft, becoming calloused and raw. She and Maeve painstakingly cleared a small patch of ground near the south wall, hauling away rocks and amending the sandy soil with dried mule dung and what little topsoil they could scrape from the base of the cliffs. They planted the seed she had so carefully saved, carrots, potatoes, hardy greens. But the high desert was a relentless adversary. The sun was scorching during the day, baking the life from the tender seedlings, and the nights were deceptively cold, stunting their growth. The wind was the worst offender, a constant thief that stole moisture from the soil and tore at the delicate leaves. Each morning brought fresh heartbreak, a row of wilted lettuce, a line of bean sprouts scoured clean from the earth. Their attempts to build a shelter were equally frustrating. A lean-to against the cliff wall offered little protection from the wind, and a small dugout sod hut was damp and perpetually cold, the earth seeming to suck the warmth right out of their bodies. Despair began to creep in, a chilling fog that settled in Annalise's bones. Maeve grew quieter, her hope dwindling with each failed plant. One afternoon, exhausted and defeated, Annalise slumped against the vast, sun-drenched face of the south-facing cliff. The wind howled over the canyon rim, but here, at the base of the rock, the air was still. She closed her eyes, and a strange sensation seeped into her awareness. It was warmth. Not the harsh, direct heat of the sun, but a deep, resonant warmth radiating from the stone itself, a heat that felt ancient and alive. It soaked into the tired muscles of her back, a gentle, persistent comfort. Her eyes snapped open. She pressed her palm flat against the sandstone. It was unmistakably, wonderfully warm. Her father's words flashed in her mind, no longer cryptic, but brilliantly, stunningly clear. Stone remembers the sun. He wasn't a poet. He was a geologist. It wasn't a metaphor. It was a statement of thermal mass. The stone cliff face spent all day absorbing the relentless solar energy, and all night, it slowly, steadily released it. The cliff wasn't just a wall, it was a massive, passive engine. A gigantic hearth. She wasn't meant to build on the land. She was meant to build with it. A wild, audacious idea took root in her mind, an idea of such scale and strangeness that it made her heart pound with a mixture of terror and exhilarating hope. The work that followed was brutal, a daily battle against the earth itself. The plan that had formed in Annalise's mind was simple in concept, but monumental in execution. They would not build a house, they would excavate one. They would carve their shelter directly into the earth at the base of the heat-storing south-facing cliff, using the planet itself as three of their walls and their roof. The front, the open side of their long, shallow dwelling, would be a wall not of stone or sod, but of glass, creating a vast, sunken greenhouse that would trap the sun's light and the stone's radiating warmth. It was a mad vision, built on a single sentence from a dead man. With only a pickaxe, 2 shovels, and their own dwindling strength, Annalise and Maeve began to dig. Annalise would swing the heavy pickaxe, the shock of each blow jarring her arms and shoulders, breaking up the compacted soil and rock. Maeve, her movement slow but steady, would follow with the shovel, scooping the loosened earth into buckets which Annalise then hauled away. They worked in a slow, determined rhythm, their movements becoming a grim choreography of survival. Blisters formed on Annalise's hands, broke, and reformed as thick calluses. Her back ached with a fire that never fully extinguished. Some days, the sheer scale of the task felt insurmountable, the mountain of excavated earth growing with agonizing slowness. But every evening, as the sun set, she would place her hand on the cliff face and feel its stored warmth, a silent promise that fueled her for the next day's labor. The glass was the greatest challenge. There was no money to buy it. Annalise loaded the wagon with the last of their saleable possessions, a silver locket of her grandmother's, a set of leather-bound books that had been her mother's pride, and made the long journey to the next town. There, she found the ruins of a grand hotel that had burned down the year before. She tracked down the owner and bartered her heirlooms for the right to salvage the window panes, many of which were miraculously intact, though blackened with soot. For a week, she painstakingly chipped away mortar and wood, freeing the large panes of glass and loading them onto the wagon. The journey back was a torment of anxiety, every bump in the road threatening to shatter her fragile, precious cargo. She returned not with money or food, but with a wagon full of dirty glass, the key to their improbable salvation. As the long trench at the base of the cliff deepened and the strange collection of salvaged window frames grew, they began to attract visitors. The spectacle of 2 women, one old and frail, the other young but worn, attempting to dig a home out of the canyon floor was a source of great curiosity and ridicule in Redemption Gulch. They became known as the Canyon Fools, for the old trapper was the first to come. He stood at the edge of their excavation, his face etched with genuine concern. "Annalise, I've seen men try things like this before," he said, his voice low and kind. "They try to winter in caves or dugouts. The earth is a cold mother. She'll steal your heat faster than the sun can give it. That rock might feel warm now, but in the deep of winter, the frost will go 6 feet down. You're digging your own grave, child." His warning was born of experience, and it planted a seed of doubt that Annalise had to fight to uproot every morning. Next came Dr. Alastair, a man of science and books. He peered down at the damp earth and shook his head with clinical authority. "Madam, you are creating a perfect environment for consumption and lung sickness. This subterranean dwelling will be a pit of dampness and unhealthy humors. You are endangering your mother's already fragile health, the town preacher followed, his Bible clutched in his hand. He spoke of pride and the folly of attempting to create a private Eden, suggesting their hardship was a test of faith that they were failing by resorting to such an unnatural and hubristic scheme. Perhaps the cruelest were the young ranch hands who would sometimes ride to the canyon rim to mock them. Their jeers and laughter echoed off the rock walls, small, sharp blows against Annalise's already frayed nerves. Through it all, she kept digging. She listened to their warnings, their pity, and their scorn, and she met it with a quiet, unyielding silence. Her only answer was the rhythmic scrape of her shovel against the stone. She was utterly alone in her conviction, with only Maeve, who worked beside her with a quiet trust that was more precious to Annalise than any encouragement, and the secret warmth of the stone against her back. The world saw a grave, she saw a womb. The final pane of glass was set in place just as the sky began to take on the bruised, purple-grey color of a deep winter storm. They had built rough wooden frames for the salvaged glass and sealed every crack and joint with a mixture of clay and straw. It was a patchwork wall of mismatched panes, ugly and imperfect, but it was whole. It sealed the front of their long, 50-foot earthen room, turning their dugout into a sunken conservatory. Inside, the air was still and smelled of damp earth and curing clay. The long beds they had prepared were filled with the transplanted seedlings that had struggled outside, now safe from the wind. The back wall was the sheer, living rock of the canyon. The roof was 2 feet of packed earth. They had just finished moving their few possessions inside when the first flakes of snow began to fall, not drifting lazily, but driven horizontally by a wind that shrieked like a banshee. The blizzard that Orin had predicted had arrived. The temperature plummeted. The world beyond their glass wall dissolved into a maelstrom of white. The wind hammered against the panes, and Annalise watched, her heart in her throat, as the fragile barrier between them and the killing cold bowed and shuddered. The noise was terrifying, a constant, high-pitched scream that seemed to be trying to tear their sanctuary apart. But the glass held. Inside, the silence was profound. They lit a single lantern, its small flame casting a warm, steady glow. Annalise went to the back of the shelter and placed her hand against the sandstone cliff. It was still radiating its gentle, stored heat. The vast thermal battery was working. As the first night wore on, the difference between their world and the one outside became starkly, miraculously clear. Outside was a maelstrom of lethal cold. Inside, the temperature held steady. It was not warm like a room with a roaring fire, but it was a living temperature, cool but comfortable, and the air was fresh and breathable. They huddled together under their blankets, listening to the storm rage, and for the first time in months, Annalise felt a flicker of something she had thought was lost forever, a sense of safety. The test had begun. The blizzard did not relent. For days that bled into weeks, the world was an endless, howling vortex of white. The snow piled up against their glass wall, burying them completely, so that the only light that filtered in was a dim, ethereal blue glow. They were entombed, living in a bubble of stillness beneath a raging sea of ice and wind. The initial relief gave way to a new kind of terror. The strain and the damp, subterranean air were too much for Maeve. She began to cough, a dry, shallow sound that sent a spear of fear through Annalise's heart. It was a different cough than Thomas's, but it was a cough nonetheless. Soon, a fever set in, and her breathing became a ragged, painful struggle. Pneumonia. The doctor was in Redemption Gulch, a world away, separated from them by an impassable wall of snow and cold. There would be no help. Annalise was alone, watching her mother fade in the blue twilight of their shelter. Despair threatened to finally overwhelm her. But then, she looked around at the world she had built. The air, unlike the dry, searing heat of a wood stove that was so hard on ailing lungs, was humid. The rows of vegetables, protected from the frost and nurtured by the faint light and the warmth of the rock, were not just surviving, they were thriving. Small, vibrant green shoots of lettuce, spinach, and kale pushed up from the dark soil. The gentle, constant warmth radiating from the stone wall kept the worst of the chill at bay, creating a stable environment that did not shock the system. Annalise brewed teas from the mint and thyme she had planted, the warm steam helping to ease Maeve's breathing. She crushed wild garlic into broths. She made poultices. She fought the illness not with medicine she didn't have, but with the life-giving properties of the shelter itself. Slowly, miraculously, the tide began to turn. The fever broke. Maeve's breathing eased, the rattling in her chest subsiding. One morning, Annalise awoke to find her mother sitting up, watching a single, perfect pea sprout unfurl a new leaf. "It's beautiful," Maeve whispered, her voice weak but clear. In that moment, Annalise knew they had won. They had not just survived the storm, they had created a place where life could flourish in the very heart of death. When the great blizzard finally broke after nearly a month, the world that emerged was silent, white, and profoundly changed. The sun shone on a landscape buried under 10 feet of snow, a pristine and lethal beauty. A few days later, a figure appeared at the canyon rim, a dark shape against the blinding white. It was Orin. He had made his way there on snowshoes, his face gaunt and etched with worry, assuming he was coming to find their frozen bodies. He saw the impossible, a patch of melted snow and, below it, a long line of glass from which a faint vapor rose. He scrambled down the slope and peered through a clear patch on a pane. He saw Annalise, alive. He saw Maeve, weak but recovering. And he saw rows of green, living plants. He slowly, deliberately, took off his fur hat, holding it in his hands as if he were in church. "I was wrong," he said, his voice thick with awe and disbelief. "God forgive me, I was wrong." He was the first of many. News of the canyon miracle spread through the starving, freezing settlement of Redemption Gulch. The doctor came, humbled and ashamed, and asked for fresh greens for the children suffering from scurvy. The preacher arrived, speaking not of pride, but of the miracles of ingenuity God grants to the desperate. Even the young men who had mocked her came, hats in hand, offering to work in exchange for a share of the food. Mr. Finch was ruined. The deep frost had frozen his precious stream solid, and the winter had killed most of his cattle. He left the territory in disgrace, defeated not by a direct confrontation, but by a quiet, unyielding plant. Annalise shared everything she had. She gave away food freely and, more importantly, she shared her knowledge. She taught them about thermal mass, about the orientation of the sun, about using the earth itself as an ally instead of an enemy. The following spring, other families began digging. The canyon, once a symbol of desolation, became a place of community and innovation. Annalise lived a long and peaceful life, never remarrying, content to be the matriarch of the strange, thriving community she had built. She was forever known as the woman who had survived the killer winter, the one who had taught the stone to remember the sun. The story of Annalise is more than just a tale of survival against the odds. It is a testament to the power of a single, unconventional idea in the face of overwhelming skepticism. It is a reminder that the most profound solutions are sometimes found not in fighting nature, but in understanding it, not in imposing our will upon the world, but in listening to the quiet wisdom it has to offer. Her legacy was not built of stone and glass, but of resilience, intelligence, and a generosity of spirit that turned her personal victory into a communal one. In your own life, you will face your own impossible winters, your own chorus of doubters who tell you that your plans are foolish and your hopes are naive. When that time comes, remember the widow who looked at a barren rock and saw a hearth. Remember that forgotten knowledge and quiet observation can be more powerful than conventional force. The world is full of stone walls that remember the sun, waiting for someone with the courage to see them. If her story of resilience and ingenuity moved you, please share it with others who might need a reminder that even in the coldest winter, it is possible to cultivate a garden of hope. Subscribe for more stories of those who dared to prove the world wrong.